Welcome to Postdoom, regenerative conversations exploring overshoot grief, grounding, and gratitude. I'm your host, Michael Dowd, and in this conversation, recorded in September 2019, I speak with Karl North, a farmer, a systems teacher. His website is Eco-Intelligence. It's Karl North, K-A-R-L, north.com. And he has a set of core papers and an introduction to systems thinking course. They're just really fabulous. He's also a good writer and just a beautiful soul, an older brother on the sustainability path. I think you'll enjoy this conversation. People who aren't familiar with you or your website, if you could just sort of give us a little sense of your background and sort of what you bring to the world, and then if you could just take a few minutes and just highlight some of the more important stuff up on your website. And again, it's KARL north.com.
Well, I can talk better about it when I talk about kind of my journey to this. The worldview we're going to talk about.
Okay, that's fine.
The Karl North Intelligence is a combination of early learning about how our modern society works. So I've written a more recent kind of discussion of that called The Age of Modernity and Its Discontents. But also learning about how the larger natural world works, both as ecosystems, as complex systems, and as historical systems through my study of anthropology. And I was very lucky to be in a kind of a graduate program that emphasized the ecological base of societies that we studied.
Yeah, that's great. Well, why don't you let that... Yeah, why don't you let that lead into sort of the heart of this particular conversation series is various teachers, thought leaders, a few activists as well, but folks sharing their own personal journey of how they, what their worldview was like growing up and their education, and how you came to, for yourself, how you came to an understanding of an ecological worldview, how you came to a systems understanding of reality, and also a sense of contraction, of collapse, of that it's not perpetual progress. So take as long as you'd like, but share some of your story of how you came to be where you are now, and were there any particularly challenging emotional times in that process, as there has been for many of us. Okay.
I was interested in your first question about language.
Oh, well, go. Yeah, let's go there first then. So,
what was the term post-doom mean? And I think it doesn't mince words. It doesn't soften the message, which is good. But I think a lot of people they interpret doom as in a very emotional way, a negative emotional way that probably doesn't help to tell the message. Right. So I've been looking for other ways to talk about that. For quite a while, I use the term energy descent, which I think is accurate, but tends to be abstract, and people don't think about the implications of the energy we use, so it doesn't really tell them too much.
Right.
And more recently, I like the phrase, the great simplification. Mm-hmm. For a couple of reasons. It doesn't soften the message. It's great simplification. In my estimate of it is that we will no longer have industrial civilization as we know it, or maybe any industrial civilization. In fact, I kind of think that the word civilization, like civilization reboot, is not the best way to put it either, because people will kind of grasp onto the word civilization, say, oh, we can get it back, right? Which is, I don't think, from the point of the laws of thermodynamics, possible.
Yes, exactly. And
so, but the great, there was a part of the early ecological movement in the 60s and 70s talked about the positive aspects of a simpler society, There was Shoemaker's Small is Beautiful. A lot of people wrote about that kind of thing. And so I think that kind of induces a positive way of thinking about when we go back to a lower energy society.
Yeah, I agree. Just yesterday, I had a conversation with Sam Alexander in Melbourne, and he's part of the Simplicity Institute there. And one of the main things we were discussing was were the benefits, the advantages of living in a simpler, less energy intensive, less consumerist and thing oriented way.
Right. And I can talk more about the influence of anthropological studies on how I think about this simplification as we get more into it. But
Yeah.
I agree with some of the other words you use. Catabolic collapse. I'm sure that's built in to the process.
Your microphone, just so you know, your microphone moved a little bit further away from your mouth. So if you could put it a little bit closer.
Yeah.
Yep. There we go.
How about that?
That's great. Thanks.
Okay. So yeah, I think people like John Greer have talked a lot about the catabolic collapse, and I think he's got it pretty well persuasive
Yes.
discussion of that. It involves population die-off for sure. With so much less energy, you can only have so many people supported. And that gets to my understanding, my study of ecology, that there's a carrying capacity, and the carrying capacity is going to erode when you don't have the energy to support it.
Well, something, say, because you've mentioned it already in terms of energy descent, and I completely agree, there will be some people who will be either seeing this or listening to this conversation that aren't quite sure, they're maybe new to this. So say a little bit about energy descent and the great simplification in terms of like physical reality of it.
Right. Well, what we know from the laws of thermodynamics is you can't create or destroy energy or matter. That's the first law. And the second is that you got to keep energy pulsing through whatever you're producing, or it's going to fall apart. That's kind of the entropy law, the things fall apart law, that some people call it. And when we're depleting the finite source of energy that we have, which is the fossil fuels, then it's inevitable that at some point you just don't have them in enough. You still have them, but they're so difficult to get out that the energy cost becomes too great.
Yes.
One good example of that is corn ethanol. It actually uses more energy than it produces.
Exactly.
And the emphasis on so-called renewables has the same problem, that the energy, the net energy that you get out of them is just not enough to run into industrial civilization.
Right.
So that's kind of the physics basics of it.
That's great. So there's a decreasing energy return on energy invested, meaning that it keeps taking more energy and more money in many cases to get energy. And so that diminishing returns notion, and that solar and wind panels and other forms of so-called renewable technologies require a lot of fossil fuels in their own construction and transportation and what have you, but they also don't have the return to be able to empower anything like an industrial civilization.
Right.
Yeah.
And we can save the fossil fuels, but that means we don't get to use them. So
Right.
there's really no option other than, as Heinberg has said, powering down.
I'm assuming at some point you had an understanding of sort of the secular religion of perpetual progress, and then that shifted. So how was that for you?
Yeah, well, I've tried to kind of condense it into 4 or 5 points. One of the things is that I think where I differ from other people who have gone through this process, and some of the other main writers in the peak oil movement differ too, is that they don't talk much about grief.
Yes.
Greer, Hagen, Orloff, Kunstler, even Martinson most of the time don't really talk much about grief. And I felt very little grief either. And so I've kind of tried to think about, well, why did that happen?
Yeah.
And I think along with some of these other writers, most of us are getting on in age. And we've been at this kind of journey for quite a long time. In my case, since the 1960s. I turned 81 yesterday.
Oh.
So I've got this long journey behind me, and it started quite a long time ago. And I think that's true of some of these other more well-known writers as well. And so that we've been able to go at this transition slowly enough that it never triggered an emotional response that I would call grief, at least not yet. Maybe it'll happen later on, I don't know. But that's an interesting thing. And so when I try to think about how I would talk about the journey of transition, you know, I said, well, I have to really go back to my 20s. And at that time, that was just getting into the 1960s, which was a time of upheaval and critique of society as it was, that I felt was familiar to me because I grew up in a rural environment. And so I was not, until I was in my mid-teen, until I was about 12, I really, the only input I got about the modern world was from my parents, who were scientists. And they taught me how things work and to think critically about how things work. And unfortunately for maybe the institutions, I started to think about how institutions work. And so I started going to school, and I got the feeling by the time I was in my late elementary school, there was something really flawed about schooling, but I didn't know what it was. But I started getting a feeling of pushback against the institution, and that just got worse. I went to what was considered a very good liberal arts college, and their ideal was to create the well-rounded education, but most of the subjects were taught by specialists, and say they really couldn't deliver the goods.
What school?
And so I got very unhappy with my liberal arts education, supposed liberal arts education, and started looking around for alternatives. And I found a guy who was studying both Marx and Freud, both of which were taboo to a lot of social science. And then I got a chance to go to study in Paris. And so there was a much broader range of political and economic thought in Europe at the time. And I said, wow, that's pretty interesting. Mm-hmm. So I started studying, taking advantage of that. And so when the 60s came around, I had a pretty good vantage point from which to criticize society. And I had gone, my wife and I, as soon as we were married, we decided to take leave of industrial society and go work in Africa. And so I taught school in Africa for a couple of years, and that led to anthropological studies. But it also gave me a feeling that simple societies were not just primitive, terrible places. I would visit villages where, Kunstler has this series called World Made by Hand. I would visit villages where everything was made by hand. Yeah. I said, wow, this is great. I was interested in music from a very early age. and very sophisticated musical instruments in West Africa were made by hand from, goat skins and wood and stuff like that. And so that was quite an epiphany. So that set me up to study anthropology and to study so-called primitive societies in ways that were not negative.
Yes.
That were positive.
Yes.
And so that was kind of an early beginning to, I guess, what I would call the journey of transition. Then because I was required in graduate school to study ecology, actually it was Eugene Odom's book that you've talked about, which was an early pioneer.
Well, mention the title of that book here for people listening to this conversation.
I think it was just an introduction to ecology. I can't remember the exact title, but yeah. Eugene Odom's was the first to do a textbook. It's yes. A very small textbook. And actually, as I mentioned to you, it was his brother who really expanded the discipline and really made it a scientific discipline based on energy flow and energy storages, and actually came out with a general, developed a general framework for studying complex systems, whether they're human societies or natural ecosystems or even inanimate systems like our planetary social system. It's all in terms of of depleting an energy gradient. All activity everywhere, whether it's inanimate or animate, is like that. And so that's what I got into later on. But I quit graduate school. I didn't even want to be involved in the institution of academia. And for 7 years, we went back to Europe, and I kind of did a self-apprenticeship in farming. We had goats and we had sheep, and there were people who still used those simpler technologies that I could learn from a little bit. And when we came back, I got involved in the organic farming movement, and I found an ecologist, a range ecologist by the name of Alan Savory, who wrote a book called Holistic Management. I have a copy here if you want to.
Yeah, I've actually I've looked at that. I don't own it, but I've also watched several presentations of his online. Yeah,
he's got into kind of sequestering carbon, but the original idea was first with farmers, but then with just about anybody to create a framework for decision making where you would look at the larger context of things. It's really a pushback against the whole way of doing science in the modern age, which was reductionist. Which is, it's the Latin word that they use, the phrase that they use is ceteris paribus, which is everything else being equal. In other words, you shove all of the other aspects of reality aside, and you just look at a couple of them in a laboratory context. And that's what a lot of scientists have done for the last 3 centuries, and the technologies that have come out of that don't take into account the context, and so that's been the problem.
Exactly.
So I was very excited about discovering holistic management under Alan Savory, and he did some training of teachers, and I trained to be a teacher, and then I brought that training into the organic farming movement, because I thought the organic farming movement had really no ecological framework to work from, because it was hit and miss kind of thing. We were making progress, but there was no agricultural science in the land-grant agricultural schools that was ecosystem based. And the program was all pretty much separate stuff: soil scientist, weed science, livestock science, but not the whole enchilada, because you have to, the whole idea of holism is you have to study problems from the point of view of the whole. And
Yes.
Savory's, really starting point when he would talk would be the world functions in wholes, and if we don't manage it that way, then we're in deep trouble.
Yes.
And so I was energized to kind of share that first with fellow farmers, and then more broadly with the stuff I've written on my website. And I haven't written a lot of published stuff the way people like Greer and Kunstler have, but during that time, I got some people interested in holistic management, and we wrote a little book called Whole Farm Planning that actually used Savory's model and adapted it to where we were doing farming in the Northeast. And that's this book. I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah, I can see it. Whole Farm Planning, Ecological Imperatives, Personal Values, and Economics. That's great. I've not seen that.
And so with a couple of us co-authored that book. And so that for a long time, that was really the only publication in hard copy that I've done. I focused mostly on talking in the ecological agriculture movement. And then when I retired, I got a chance to run a course for 4 years in ecological agriculture as part of a environmental studies program for undergraduates. And I'd studied kind of simpler pre-industrial healthy agroecosystems enough so that I could bring all of that into that course. And that was very exciting for me.
Where did you teach that?
At the University of Binghamton. It's part of the State University of New York.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I've been there.
Big university, but the environmental studies program, as you can quite imagine, was rather unfunded compared to, say, economics or whatever.
Right.
But I really enjoyed that, and I got a chance to talk about the energy descent or two undergraduates and see how they would react, and so I got a chance to test that every year for 4 years.
Wow.
And at the same time, my farm was near Ithaca, New York, which is the Ithacans consider themselves the Berkeley of the East, the kind of the progressive city of the East. And so there were a group of us, maybe half a dozen of us, who decided to actually share the energy descent story by doing some writing, putting it up on a website, and we called it Tompkins County Relocalization. We were taking the whole county as a whole to work with, and how would that need to change as the energy went away. And so I wrote a lot for that, and quite a bit of that is on my website as well. Mm-hmm. That website, tclocal.org, still exists in a kind of a simplistic way, but it's kind of toned down. Mm-hmm. Doesn't have all the bells and whistles it used to have, mm-hmm. but it's still there. People want to see it, and all the writing is still there. And we did some hard copy publishing. We sent it around to all the people we thought were influentials, in Tompkins County, and it didn't get a lot of traction. So I was thinking, wow, this is really hard.
Yes.
And so a lot of other people who were doing that kind of thing had encountered the same problem, what's now the proverbial Cassandra syndrome, the story of Cassandra's. She got a witch turned her into you know, I forget what they call it in those days, but she got bewitched, and so that she knew the truth of everything. She could foretell everything, but nobody would believe her.
Yes.
And so that's
yes.
kind of the problem that we've had.
A prophet doomed to never be able to be accepted.
Right, right. And so I think a lot of us have been struggling with that ever since.
Yes.
So that's kind of my early transition. I always went back to my rural childhood to kind of draw on what was a non-urban existence like, you know, because I've lived in Paris, I've lived in Geneva, Switzerland. I've spent quite a bit of time in New York City, but I always go back, and I guess that's what drew me back to farming too. Is people say, well, farmers, they can't make any money, but one of the attractions was, well, I could go back to my rural childhood and enjoy all those things that you know you can't enjoy in academia and city life and so on and so forth. And so I did, and I have really enjoyed being a farmer ever since, just for that reason alone.
Yes.
And thinking about, well, how could we change farming, and how would that look in other aspects of life? And trying to model, when I was a full-time farmer, some of those changes. For example, I did a lot of my work with draft horsepower, and I studied. I got really interested in the Amish because of that, and because of my social science background, I knew how to read that kind of literature, the literature of Amish sociology. So I read books like this one, The Amish Study for the Amish Struggle with Modernity.
Yeah, the Amish struggle with modernity, right?
And you can see a picture of the big round bale.
Right.
And actually the farmers that took over from me, what you do is you have draft horses, you have maybe 6 or 8 of them pulling a forecart with a motor on it that can run things like this round baler. And the people who took over went the next step, and they did that. Mm-hmm. But that gets the Amish into a situation that everybody is going to be into in the energy descent. Yeah. And so that was very interesting to me, that you're trying to keep hold of these technologies, but it sucks you into reliance on stuff that you really need to get away from. So that was an interesting experience, the struggle with of the Amish, that their youth are more and more moving away from the Amish ideal, and that's part of the sociology of their struggle, and it's kind of a tragedy. But there are Amish who maintain the old ideas, and what was interesting to me is, as an anthropologist, I saw that they used religion to maintain a technology that is actually more sustainable than most of what we have today.
Yes.
And so the anthropological idea that religion can have not just a negative aspect, but it can have a positive aspect in society, is something that the Amish actually made use of, and I could study that.
Yes, well, I've been influenced along those lines by reading Edward Teddy Goldsmith's 1978, I think, book called The Stable Society. What he means is a sustainable society. And then his magnum opus, The Way, an Ecological Worldview, where he really talks about the role of religion, the role of life ways in helping to ensure that limits are honored as invaluable, as sacred, And that without that element in society, without some element of society, usually religion or life ways, speaking with moral authority, that the future must never be compromised by the present. Without some moral voice insisting on accountability to the future, then societies, simply by pursuing what's good for them in the moment, can actually be destructive of the soil, the forest, the water, the life upon which they and their grandchildren and great-grandchildren will depend.
Uh-huh. Well, I would agree with all of that. I would push back a little bit. I got interested because you mentioned the way, and so I read it, and I would push back a little bit against this idea that somehow we can find in the history of humanity a purpose, in the sense of a intelligent design or divine purpose. I
certainly did. I didn't read him that way. I mean, he talked about teleos within the living world in terms of sort of Gaia, but I don't think he meant it. Whatever he meant is somewhat irrelevant. I agree with you that that purpose is an interpretive term, and there is no one purpose. But
yeah.
If our, from my own sense, if our sense of our purpose, if how we interpret our purpose as groups or as a species or as individuals, if that doesn't include living in a way that's a blessing to the future, if it's simply, if we don't see our purpose as in some way ensuring accountability to the future, then I think we have a self-destructive sense of mission or purpose.
Sure. Yeah, I was just, I guess my interpretation of Goldsmith was that he was kind of encroaching on what we know, I think, about evolutionary biology and what we know from systems science, that there's an uncertainty that comes to play such that there could have been another direction that society took at the advent of agriculture, but we don't really know. There's no kind of final cause leading us to a certain future.
Yes.
And
exactly.
Then I read a book, a couple of ecologists by the name of Schneider and Sagan wrote a book called Into the Cool. Energy from Thermodynamics.
Energy flow, thermodynamics, and life.
Right.
And who are the authors?
Schneider and Sagan.
Oh,
Dorian Sagan.
Dorian Sagan. That's Carl Sagan's son. Yes.
And what's interesting about their book, he went, it's all about how we can look at all activity in the universe as depleting an energy gradient. I don't know if that makes sense to you, or
No, I'm familiar with this. I'll be getting a copy of that book thanks to your recommendation.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, the last chapter is called Purpose in Life.
Okay.
And I said, holy cow, what's he gonna say? He said, well, if there's a purpose in life, it's to degrade an energy gradient, but not beyond that, because we can't really tell how things are going to turn out. Mm-hmm. It's kind of what I know from systems science or complexity science or holistic science, whatever you want to call it, is that at any moment, things can take a new turn, because initial conditions change the direction of activity. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of a cardinal principle of complexity science, that initial, it's kind of comes out of chaos theory. Mm-hmm. You know, yes. If a butterfly flaps its wings in Tokyo, it may create a tornado to happen in Havana. No, that kind of thing. And so but if it doesn't flap its wings, then something else might happen in Havana, you know? So at any point, history can take a new direction, and we can't really say that there's an ultimate goal to that.
Right. No, exactly. And but that whatever those directions are, they happen within a certain set of thermodynamic and ecological constraints.
Right. So what Schneider and Sagan are saying is that if you want to talk about a purpose in life, it's to degrade a gradient.
Right.
So anyway, that's what I got out of that.
Yeah. Well, thanks for recommending that. So coming back to your own story, your own life experience.
I guess one of the few other things I would say is there's a lot of debate in the energy descent network about what we can do. And one of the lessons for me for the 60s, being in the anti-war movement as I was to realize just how much mind control there is and how little impact the anti-war movement or any part of the 60s had on that. In fact, it was actually a reaction against the whole thing later on in the 70s and 80s and 90s. So I asked myself, so what can we do in the face of this mind control? And I could see that the large centralized institutions were going to go on, and because they had control of our minds, but in much smaller scale, we could start doing things. And so that was kind of the sense that the people in the Tompkins County relocalization movement had, to call it relocalization. They thought if we could help the transition along at the very much smaller scale. People talk about the Dunbar scale, 100 to 200 people is the only really successful size for a community. Maybe it's bigger than that, I don't know, but you know, there were communities that I saw in West Africa of 2,000, 3,000 people. There was a headman, but the anthropologists have found that in those types of societies, the kings, the headmen, the rulers, whatever you want to call them, were pretty much hedged around with a lot of constraints. And although they could go berserk and kill a lot of people if they wanted to, pretty much most of the time they didn't, and they had to follow these constraints. And so there may be a spectrum of population range from up to 2 or 3 or 4,000 or more, where you could actually have a decent society.
Yes.
And so that's been my kind of direction of thinking ever since.
Sure.
And so there are a lot of people who want to kind of change the world by going to Washington or going to the United Nations, and I just don't think that's going to happen anymore. So I just want to throw that out as my take on knowing what I knew about capitalist political economy. I think they're pretty much in control all the way down.
Yeah.
At least for a long time.
Yeah, I agree with you. Are you familiar with, actually, David Sloan Wilson, I believe, also lives in Binghamton, and he wrote a book on neighborhood, applying evolutionary principles to a neighborhood scale organizing. Are you familiar with David and that book?
I'm familiar with his writings, but not that book.
Yeah.
So, yeah, if you could send me
I'll do that. I'll send you the link, because David, Connie and I have stayed with him and Ann a couple times when we've been in Binghamton. I've spoken at the Unitarian Church, and I think I spoke at the university as well.
Binghamton University is an interesting place, even though it's a large university. There's something called the Brodel Institute, and this is a people who are kind of marginalized by conventional social science. They picked up on a trend in Europe called the world systems And there was a political scientist, political economist, who was really into world systems, and he created the Brodel Instrument. And Brodel is a Frenchman who was very instrumental in the world system. So they take a very holistic, long-range view of society, going back through history. History is very important, and the broader view of not just economy or politics or religion, but the larger enchilada, so to speak. There have been critics throughout the modern age of the modern age itself. And one of them was Oswald Spengler, and I've read his book. And Weber wrote a book about, he's written about Protestant and capitalism and the modern age, and how Protestantism has kind of facilitated capitalism.
Very much
Because
so.
there's a synergy between the two. And so I've read those. Can't think of anything else right off, but I'll
Did you read Toynbee? I'm curious. Arnold Toynbee?
pieces of it, yeah.
Yeah,
I'm familiar with the thesis, but Toynbee, yeah.
Yeah, many of us have read pieces of Toynbee. Spengler too is quite a read.
Oh yeah, he's terrible. He's all over the map with the way he writes. But once you grind your way through it, it makes a lot of sense.
What's your take on sort of the big picture, and do you see?
Because of what I am taking from lessons from complexity science, I don't think the past that we've had is inevitable. I think it could have taken a different turn at any point. That's their view on how things happen.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think, for the same reason, that we're doomed to a particular future. I think what we probably both agree on is that we're constrained by a future, but how that will happen and how the transition will take place is pretty uncertain, and we can only do scenarios.
Yeah.
And so I've spent a lot of time trying to think and write about scenarios. I did a piece that I have on my website, cities, let's see. Cities in the suburbs in the energy descent. Cities being pretty vulnerable to this transition period because of the amount of energy that they use. So what will replace them? Will there be anything left of cities? And so I did some writing about that. Ways we could talk about the energy descent in a positive way. And so I wrote something that's on the website called The Benefits to, it would be an outline of benefits from a lower energy civilization. I kind of boiled it down. It seemed, as the more I got into it, the more it seemed, I actually wrote this as co-authored with.
Your microphone is way away from you then.
Sorry.
No problem.
So as I got into the subject, I realized that you have to take a holistic point of view. So the benefits are in all aspects of life. In social relations, that if we get technological solutions that aren't damaging at a lower energy, in a lower energy society, that's a benefit. And if we get, if we get back to a kind of human scale communities, we don't get this alienation and anomie that the Marxists and and the social sciences have written about that is so typical of the modern age, that everybody's kind of, and the individualism. So we can get back to a more of a cooperative types of communities, of which I saw among the Amish and in my work in West Africa.
Yes, of course.
They're much more cooperative. And so reading the anthropological literature that corroborated that there were social relations in earlier types of societies that were much more healthy, even gender relations were more healthy than what we have today.
Mm-hmm.
So that was something I wrote about. And of course the economy, being a much more local economy, people be in much more local control of that economy.
Yes.
And we had a little taste of that because I was part of a Ithaca farmers market in Ithaca, in the city of Ithaca.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a very successful one because of the kind of city Ithaca, the kind of population community Ithaca is. And so we were able to make a very small dent in the way people, consumers interact with farmers, and how that would look when everybody, when had to be a lot more farmers.
Mm-hmm.
and people were much closer in touch with the places where they got their food. You know, I always invited people that came to our booth in the farmer's market, come out to our farm and see what it's like, you know, see how we produce it.
Well, you've got a whole bunch of them that are related to visioning county food production.
That's it, right, that's it.
Yeah, you've got looks like 6-part series on that.
So that was an early contribution to what would a county food system look like, both at the farming level and in town, you know, the consuming level, when there was no more fossil fuel.
Mm-hmm.
And I drew on kind of anthropological and historical examples of really productive but quite sustainable, relatively sustainable farming systems, like actually wetland systems like the Aztecs had in Mexico City.
Mm.
But also even colonial America, there were farming systems based on floodplains.
Yes.
In New England, where the part of the plain would be flooded and would bring in new soil, actually soil that had run down off the hills where they were doing row crop agriculture. And so it would be recaptured and then recycled through haying and livestock and manure. Mm-hmm. In that farming system. That occurred in places in New England where there were these floodplains along streams. So it was actually something that we can retrieve from the history of farming.
Mm-hmm. Karl, I want to ask you, again, one of the things that I want to do in this series is point people to particularly excellent resources, and your website and your core papers and your course are that. So just say a little bit about sort of the two papers at the very top, Invisible Ships and Boiling Frogs, The End of Industrial Affluence, and Systems Thinking for Problem Solvers. Say something a little bit about that, and also about the course that you have linked there, which is Understanding Problem Situations as If Complexity Mattered, an introductory course in systems thinking.
Oh yes, that reminds me, I was asked to do an online introductory course in systems thinking that had a few cycles of operation, but it didn't last because there wasn't, even there, it was hard to get people to transition to out of reductionist thinking to systems thinking and to value it. But for me, it was very valuable, and I still have all of those course materials that I put on my website. So anybody who wants to use those, I think that's one way. There have been a lot of introductions to systems thinking, but I think systems thinking gets us a big step in the direction of thinking about the energy transition.
Yes.
So I would recommend that any kind of introduction to systems thinking is not just mine.
Yeah.
Is a way to go.
And that's great. And you mentioned the age of modernity and its discontents. Is that a presentation? Is that a course? What is that?
That's a paper that I wrote, and it's on my website. The key themes of modernity that I wanted to talk about were capitalism and the reductionist way of doing science, and how they fed into each other, how there was a synergy between them.
Got it.
And if we can be aware of that kind of narrative and how it's taken over our thinking, then we can get away from both of those ways of thinking and think more easily about the energy descent and what's next. So that was what was the motive for the age of modernity.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the last question that I want to ask, Karl, is related to, the fact that you celebrated your 81st birthday yesterday, that you've been in this for so long and had this awareness, so that grief isn't the first thing that comes up for you, because you've been intellectually aware of these patterns for decades. And yet you've also expressed a couple of times the reality that there are those of us who are speaking from an ecologically grounded systemic place, and the reception that we get among our friends, family, neighbors, and the wider public is so frustratingly small. How has that been for you? You're now 81 years old. I mean, as you feel, not just think about the future, where does your heart hurt, and how do you take care of that?
Well, I wish I could be more broadly effective, but I live, when I retired from commercial farming, we moved to a part of Maine that's always had a very almost dead economy. It was based on fishing, and factory fishing took over, and they fished it out. And so there wasn't much left except summer people and doing construction for summer people and stuff like that. So it's been an economy in decline for a long time, and people have had to make do by becoming kind of jack of all trades. They would piece things together, and they would trade with each other. And so my present activity along those lines is to kind of facilitate this, what I call a gift economy.
Yes.
It gets away from money, and I've noticed that a lot of people have obligations to each other where they're just fulfilling these obligations when there's no money involved.
Yes, exactly.
And a bunch of these people are my neighbors, and back in New York, you didn't have people like that.
Yeah.
Except among the Amish, and I didn't live among the Amish at that time. And so that's encouraging. Mm-hmm. And so I've been trying to, in a very small way, facilitate that. But, apart from online discussions that don't progress very quickly, of the energy descent, that's been my main focus. I have written, I mentioned before that I'm interested in what some of the scenarios might happen. Mm-hmm. We don't know what will happen, but we can look at the the way the energy is going to deplete, and we can look at what's left and what are the possibilities. And being trained as a social scientist as well, I wrote a piece called actually I got interested in people like John Michael Greer's fiction, and then Kunstler's fiction. And I thought, wow, the fiction actually is having much more of a dent than those of us nonfiction writers. And I don't think I'm going to be a fiction writer anytime soon, but I did think that I could well bring that kind of feeling into writing about energy descent. And there's been a small attempt, actually facilitated by Greer, to collect some of these fictional works, mostly short stories, into a quarterly called Into the Ruins. Are you familiar with that?
Yes. I've seen him talk about that, Into the Ruins,
Okay.
right?
And so, I wrote to the editor. I said, "Well, look, what would be good is to publish some nonfiction as well, because the fiction writers could and the nonfiction writers could learn from each other. It'd be kind of a synergy between the two."
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Well, okay." I wrote. Let's see. I wrote a piece which is on my website that I said, "Well, why don't you publish this?" It's
The Prospect of a New Gothic Age in the United States.
Yeah, that's on the website, but in the latest issue is summer 2019, and so he published that. So I'm published finally.
Oh, that's great.
You know, I don't know how far that'll get because
Yeah, right. Well, it'll
his readership is. But that was a takeoff on a lot of the stuff that I got from Spengler, who wrote about the Gothic Age. And since there's so many fundamentalists in the United States, I thought, you know, this is be a subject we really should study, because what Spengler found out was that the Gothic Age was driven by it happened recurrently. It happened back in biblical times. With the beginning of monotheisms and all these different sects that tried to deal with the breakdown gradually of the Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. So in Spengler's idea, Gothic's age occurs every time that there's this breakdown and people are trying to deal with it. And this happened in the Middle Ages, of course, in Europe with the breakdown of the Roman Empire. And then the Reformation, which made things even worse. So I quoted, I don't know whether Spengler's or somebody else, it said there were 17 million witches burned to death in the 17th century alone.
Yeah, I think
during the Gothic Age.
Yeah, I think scholarship has considerably reduced that number, but yes.
Well, it may be. But the point being that this could happen with the breakdown of industrial civilization.
Exactly.
As well, and a prime place for it might be the United States.
For more information about this project, go to postdoom.com.